In the underworld of Naples, silence isn't just a preference. It is a law. It is the boundary between life and a shallow grave. For 15 long, agonizing years, Alessandro Moretti had been a ghost inhabiting a fortress of his own making. No woman had been allowed close enough to touch him. No heart had been permitted to beat in rhythm with his. Not after the betrayal that stained the limestone docks red. Not after the night he learned that love was nothing more than a refined weapon, designed to be twisted in the gut of the unsuspecting. At 39, Alessandro was an empire of one. His suits were tailored to a lethal perfection, his dark hair immaculate, and his expression carved into a permanent mask of quiet, terrifying threat. He was old enough to have buried every single one of his enemies, yet young enough to be the man that the new generation whispered about in the dark. Many had tried to break the ice. They brought beauty, they brought political alliances, and they brought the kind of desperation that usually moved men of power. He ignored them all with a surgical coldness. He didn't necessarily dislike women. He simply did not permit vulnerability. And in Alessandro's world, vulnerability always begins with proximity. He lived his life in the dim amber glow of his study, surrounded by ledgers and security feeds, a king who had forgotten the sound of his own name spoken with affection. To truly understand the hollow man Alessandro had become, you have to understand the carnage of his past. The screen of history fades to the grainy, desaturated colors of a memory that refuses to die. 15 years ago, the ocean beneath the Naples docks wasn't just salt and tide. It was a thick, metallic soup of blood and broken promises. Before the scars, there was a younger Alessandro. He was a man who still knew how to smile, a man who believed that loyalty was a shield rather than a target. He had held a woman's hand in a candlelit room, believing they were building a future. But the shadows were moving. A single sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the night, followed by the frantic screaming of sirens that signaled the end of his world. He had allowed someone to know him beyond his title. He had let his guard down for a woman who sold his father's coordinates for a price he would never know. That night, the boy who believed in the sacredness of a bond died on those docks. In his place, a monster was born, one constructed entirely of frost and iron. He built the Moretti estate like a medieval fortress, layering it with high-tech security that acted as his external skin. Every movement was a calculation. Every interaction was a chess move. He preferred the cold certainty of numbers over the messy unpredictability of people. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't whisper secrets to rival families in the dead of night. But the present has a way of bleeding into the most well-guarded lives. The night he first noticed her was not a night of drama. There were no cinematic thunderstorms or dramatic arrivals. There was only the quiet clinking of silver against china in the vast echoing dining hall. Alessandro sat at the head of a table that could seat 30, yet he sat alone, his eyes fixed on a report regarding shipping routes. Then, he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, steady exhale. It wasn't the ragged breath of a nervous servant or the rushed movements of someone afraid to fail. It was just human. He looked up, his gaze like a blade, and found Sofia Romano. She was 26, dressed in the modest charcoal-colored uniform of the household staff, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her eyes were not cast down in the usual show of submission. They were steady. They were observant. As she poured the wine, her hand didn't tremble. Not even a fraction of a millimeter. Alessandro felt a strange, uncomfortable prickle at the base of his neck. Most people in this city lost their ability to breathe properly when they looked at them. Their hands shook, their voices faltered, and they sought the safety of the floor. But this woman just stood there, existing in his space as if she had every right to the air she was breathing. "Is there a reason you're still standing there?" Alessandro asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that usually sent staff scurrying for the exits. Sofia didn't flinch. "I was waiting to see if you required anything else, sir," she replied. Her voice was a calm, melodic anchor in the heavy silence of the room. It had a strange presence, a weight that seemed to cut right through the tension he spent so much energy cultivating. He had reviewed her file weeks ago when she was hired, a former nurse from a high-intensity trauma ward. A woman used to seeing the worst of humanity and keeping her cool. But why would a woman with her skills choose to serve wine in a house of shadows? Why would she trade a career of saving lives for a life of subservience to a man rumored to be a devil? He decided in that moment to test her. He dismissed the rest of the staff with a sharp flick of his wrist, leaving only the two of them in the cavernous room. He let the silence stretch. 1 minute. 2. The kind of silence that usually crushed the spirit of his strongest lieutenants. Sofia simply stood by the sideboard, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. "You don't seem intimidated, Sofia," he remarked, leaning back into the shadows of his high-backed chair. "I respect the position, sir," she answered softly. "Intimidation would make me clumsy. And in a house like this, I imagine mistakes cost significantly more than money." A spark of genuine recognition flared in Alessandro's chest. She understood the stakes. She understood the architecture of his world. Over the following week, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in a decade. He watched the security feeds for a reason other than tactical safety. He watched her. He saw the way she moved through the estate, her eyes constantly scanning the exits, mapping the hallways, and noting the shift changes of the armed guards. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a tactician. She was aware of the environment in a way that suggested she was either running from something or looking for something. He found himself drawn to the mystery of her, a crack forming in the ice he had spent 15 years freezing solid. He tried to push into her personal life to find the lever he could use to control her, but she drew lines he couldn't cross. She maintained a boundary that was as firm as his own. It was a stalemate of wills in a house where his will was supposed to be the only law. Then came the night that would change everything. The estate was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of upcoming rain and expensive tobacco. Alessandro was in his private sanctum, an office that was more of a vault than a room. The door was reinforced steel disguised as mahogany, and his guards had strict orders. No one enters. No exceptions. He was staring at a photograph of the docks, the one reminder of the night he lost his soul, when he heard a knock. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a messenger. It was 3 firm, rhythmic strikes. Before he could even growl a command, the door clicked open. Sofia stepped inside. She didn't hover by the threshold like a person seeking mercy. She walked toward his desk with a purpose that bordered on defiance. "You're crossing a line, Sofia," he said, his voice dropping to a register that usually signaled a death sentence. "No one enters this room without my express permission." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it filled the room. She didn't stop until she was standing directly beside his chair, invading the personal space he had kept vacant for 15 years. She leaned down, her warmth radiating against his cold shoulder. He felt his pulse thrumming in his ears, a frantic, rhythmic drumming he hadn't felt since he was a younger, stupider man. She leaned toward his ear, her lips so close he could feel the ghost of her breath against his skin. "Alessandro," she whispered. Just his name. No title. "No, sir." Just the man buried under the armor. And in that one stolen second, 15 years of absolute icy control shattered into a million jagged pieces. His breath hitched, a sound so small it should have been swallowed by the shadows, yet it felt like a thunderclap in the confined space of the office. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. The ice that had protected his heart for over a decade wasn't just melting. It was being vaporized. For 15 years, the name Alessandro had been a title, a warning, a curse whispered by enemies in the dark. But coming from her, it sounded like a homecoming. He slowly turned his head, his face inches from hers. The air between them was electric, thick with the weight of everything he had suppressed. He saw the flecks of gold in her eyes and the unwavering strength in her gaze. He realized then that Sofia hadn't stumbled into his world by accident. She had walked into the lion's den because she was the only one who wasn't afraid of the beast. The silence that followed was different from the one he had cultivated. It wasn't cold or empty. It was expectant. He felt his fingers twitch, the instinct to reach out and touch the curve of her jaw warring with the deeply ingrained habit of isolation. Every rule he had lived by told him to cast her out, to punish the insolence, to re-establish the barrier that kept him safe. But the man beneath the boss was tired. He was tired of the silence. He was tired of the armor that had become a prison. He looked at her, his voice a jagged shadow of its former self, and asked the question that had been haunting him since she first arrived. "Why are you really here, Sofia? You didn't come here to serve wine. You didn't come here for the salary. A woman with your eyes doesn't work for a man like me unless she's looking for something." Sofia didn't blink. Her expression remained that same calm, melodic mask he had come to both admire and fear. "I'm here because I know what it's like to live behind a wall," she said softly. "I've spent years in hospitals watching people realize, too late, that the things they guarded most were the things that kept them lonely. You think your silence is your strength, Alessandro. You think it makes you untouchable. But from where I stand, you look like a man who is suffocating in a room with no windows. I didn't come here to destroy your empire. I came to see if there was anyone left inside it worth talking to." Her words were a scalpel, cutting through the layers of his ego. He let out a sharp, cynical laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a nurse, not a philosopher," he snapped, though the bite was missing from his tone. "You're playing a dangerous game. In this house, people who look for the truth usually find a bullet instead." Sofia leaned in even closer, her hand grazing the mahogany of his desk, mere inches from his own. "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of the dark," she countered. "Because the truth is, Alessandro, you've been dead for 15 years. I just wanted to see if you were ready to wake up." Before he could respond, the heavy internal phone on his desk began to buzz, a harsh, rhythmic intrusion. It was the security line. The spell was broken. He straightened his posture, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease, but the heat of her proximity lingered on his skin like a brand. He answered the phone without looking away from her. "What is it?" he demanded. It was Marco, his head of security, his voice tight with urgency. "Boss, we have a situation at the North Gate. A messenger from the Valenti family. He says he has something that belongs to you. Something from the past." Alessandro's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The Valentis. The name alone was enough to bring back the scent of salt air and the copper tang of blood. He looked at Sofia, and for the first time there was a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for the fragile, impossible moment they had just shared. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice returning to its ironclad authority. "Do not leave this room until I return. If you value your life, you will stay in the shadows." He didn't wait for her answer. He grabbed his jacket and strode out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him like a coffin lid. As he descended the grand staircase, the mansion felt different. The marble was colder, the shadows longer. At the north gate, a lone black sedan sat idling, its headlights cutting through the drizzle. A man stood leaning against the hood, a smirk playing on his lips that Alessandro recognized instantly. It was a younger Valenti, the nephew of the man who had orchestrated the betrayal 15 years ago. He held a small, weathered leather pouch in his hand. "Moretti," the man called out, his voice dripping with mock respect. "My uncle sends his regards. He said you've been quiet for a long time. Too quiet." He thought you might want a reminder of why you stopped talking in the first place. He tossed the pouch toward Alessandro. Marco caught it mid-air and handed it to his boss. Alessandro opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, the metal pitted by sea salt. He didn't need to open it to know whose face was inside. It was the locket he had given the woman who betrayed him, the one he thought had been lost to the depths of the Mediterranean on that night of blood. His vision blurred with a sudden violent rage. "Why now?" he hissed, the sound barely human. "Because," the Valenti messenger replied, getting back into his car, "my uncle heard you've taken an interest in the new staff. He wanted to remind you that every time you let a woman in, someone ends up in the water." The car sped away, leaving Alessandro standing in the rain, the locket clutched so tightly in his fist that the metal bit into his palm. He realized then that his 15 years of silence hadn't been a secret at all. His enemies had been watching, waiting for the one moment he showed a sign of life, a sign of warmth. They hadn't come for him because he was strong. They had come because they smelled a change in the wind. He looked back up at the dark windows of his office, where Sofia was waiting. He was no longer just a man protecting an empire. He was a man with a target on his back, and for the first time in 15 years, he had something he couldn't afford to lose. The rain began to lash against the stone walls of the estate as Alessandro stood there, the silver locket burning a hole in his palm. The weight of it was suffocating. Every instinct developed over 15 years screamed at him to retreat, to fortify, to eliminate the variable that had made him vulnerable. He turned back toward the mansion, his silhouette sharp against the lightning that flickered over the Mediterranean. He didn't head back to his office immediately. Instead, he walked to the security hub, a room filled with monitors and the low hum of cooling fans. Marco followed him, silent and watchful. On the screens, he could see Sofia. She was still in his office, just as he had commanded. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't snooping. She was sitting in the chair across from his desk, staring out the window at the storm. She looked small against the dark wood and leather of his world, a single candle flame in a hurricane. "Pull the internal files on Sofia Romano again," Alessandro commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Not the ones we got from the agency. I want the deep dive. Every hospital she worked at, every person she spoke to in the last 3 years. If she so much as bought a coffee near a Valenti territory, I want to know." Marco nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Boss, we checked her 3 times before she was hired. She's clean. She's a ghost." "That's the problem," Alessandro hissed. "No one is this clean in Naples. Not unless they're being erased as they go." He watched the monitor as Sofia stood up and walked to his desk. She reached out, her fingers hovering over a fountain pen he had used for a decade. She didn't pick it up. She just touched it, a gesture so intimate and gentle that it made Alessandro's chest ache. He realized then that the Valentis weren't just threatening him with the past. They were mocking his present. They saw the way he looked at her. They saw the crack in the ice before he even admitted it existed. He left the security room and climbed the stairs, his boots heavy on the marble. When he opened the office door, Sofia didn't jump. She simply turned, her eyes searching his face for the carnage she knew he had just encountered. "What happened?" she asked. Her voice was the only thing in the room that felt real to him. Alessandro walked to his desk and dropped the leather pouch onto the blotter. The locket spilled out, its silver surface dull and tarnished. Sofia looked at it, then back at him. "It's from the night on the docks, isn't it?" she whispered. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't care. "The Valentis sent a messenger," Alessandro said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "They wanted to remind me that silence has a price. And they wanted to let me know that they see you." Sofia's expression didn't change, but he saw the way her throat moved as she swallowed. "I'm not afraid of them, Alessandro." "You should be," he barked, slamming his hand onto the desk. "Everyone should be afraid of a family that uses memories as ammunition. You have no idea what you've stepped into. This isn't a hospital. There are no rules here. There is only survival and the absence of it. I told you to stay in the shadows, but the shadows are where they live." He paced the room, the adrenaline of the threat finally starting to coil into something darker, an obsessive need to protect. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the life and the warmth that the Valentis wanted to extinguish just to prove they could. "I'm moving you," he said abruptly. "You won't be in the staff quarters anymore. There is a suite on the 3rd floor, adjacent to mine. It has its own security detail and reinforced windows. You will not leave this estate. You will not speak to the other staff. To the world, you no longer exist." Sofia stood her ground, her jaw set in a line of defiance that mirrored his own. "You're trying to build another wall, Alessandro. You're trying to turn me into another piece of your collection. I didn't come here to be a prisoner. You came here to find out if I was still alive." He roared, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. "Well, congratulations, Sofia. You found him. And now that I'm awake, I realize that the only thing keeping the wolves from the door was the fact that I had nothing left to lose. Now I do. And I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let them touch you." The air in the room seemed to vanish. The anger in his voice was eclipsed by the raw, terrifying honesty of his admission. He had said it. He had admitted that she mattered. Sofia reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating frantically, a trapped bird desperate for escape. "Then don't burn the city," she whispered. "Just let me in. If we're going to be in a fortress, let's make sure it's one worth living in." Alessandro didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply covered her hand with his own, pressing it harder against his chest, as if trying to pull her strength directly into his soul. That night, for the first time in 15 years, the master of the Moretti estate didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of his office, the locket in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other, watching the feed of the hallway outside Sofia's new room. He was a man possessed, a man who had traded the safety of silence for the chaos of a name. By morning, the tension in the house had reached a fever pitch. The guards were on high alert, the air thick with the scent of gun oil and nervous energy. Alessandro called a meeting of his top lieutenants in the war room. Marco, Riccardo, and several others sat around the heavy oak table. "The Valentis are testing the perimeter," Alessandro began, his voice back to its usual cold clinical tone. "They think I'm distracted. They think the girl is a weakness. We're going to prove them right. We're going to give them a target they can't resist, and then we're going to close the trap." Marco looked concerned. "Boss, if we use her as bait—" "She isn't the bait," Alessandro interrupted, his eyes flashing with a sudden violent light. "I am. They think they can get to me through her. We're going to let them try. We're going to move the operation to the villa in Sorrento. It's harder to defend, which will make them bold. But it's also easier to clear the surrounding area. I want every Valenti asset monitored. The moment they move, we end this." As the meeting broke up, Riccardo lingered behind. "Alessandro, a word?" he asked. The older man had been his father's right hand, the only person who had stayed loyal through the bloodbath 15 years ago. "You're playing with fire, son. This girl, she's changed the way you breathe. The Valentis know it. Your men know it. If you lose your head over her, you lose the empire." "I'm not losing my head, Riccardo," Alessandro said, staring at the map on the wall. "I'm finding it. For 15 years I ran this family like a machine. Machines are predictable. A man with something to fight for? That's something they haven't seen in a long time. He left the war room and found Sofia in the library, the morning sun streaming through the high windows. She was reading an old medical journal, looking remarkably composed given the circumstances. "We're leaving for Sorrento this afternoon," he told her. "It's for your safety." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Is it for my safety, or is it because you can't stand the way I look at you in this house?" Alessandro didn't flinch. "Both," he admitted. "Sorrento is beautiful this time of year. If the world is going to end, we might as well have a view." The drive to Sorrento was a silent procession of armored black SUVs winding along the treacherous cliffs of the Amalfi coast. Inside the lead vehicle, the tension was thick enough to choke the air. Alessandro sat in the back, his gaze fixed on the passing blur of sapphire water and jagged rock, but his mind was back in that office, replaying the way Sofia's voice had bypassed every defense he had spent a decade and a half perfecting. Beside him, Sofia watched the world go by with a calm that unnerved him. Most people in her position would be hysterical or at least demanding answers. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, appearing more like a queen returning to her summer palace than a marked woman being moved to a safe house. When they reached the villa, a sprawling estate of white stone and overflowing bougainvillea, Alessandro didn't relax. If anything, his paranoia sharpened. He personally checked the perimeter, snapping at his guards and repositioning the snipers on the terrace. He was acting as a man possessed, and he knew it. He could feel Marco's questioning gaze on his back and could hear the unspoken whispers of his men. The boss is slipping. The boss has a weakness. He ignored them. He had lived in the cold for so long that the sudden heat of concern for another person felt like a fever. By sunset, the villa was bathed in a blood-orange light. Alessandro found Sofia on the balcony overlooking the sea. The wind was whipping her hair across her face, and for a moment, the sight of her against the vast open horizon made his heart skip a beat, a physical sensation he had forgotten existed. He approached her slowly, his footsteps heavy on the stone. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, though the command lacked its usual bite. "You're a target." Sofia didn't turn around. "It's beautiful, Alessandro. You spend so much time looking for threats that you've forgotten how to look at the world." He stood beside her, his hands gripping the railing. "The world is a threat, Sofia. That's the lesson I learned 15 years ago." She turned to him then, the dying light catching the intensity in her eyes. "And what did you learn today?" she asked. Alessandro looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I learned that my enemies are smarter than I thought. They knew exactly which ghost to wake up." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished locket, the metal cool against his skin. "This belonged to a woman named Elena. I loved her once. Or I thought I did. She was the daughter of a man I trusted. She sat at my table, she slept in my bed, and all the while, she was mapping the exits for the Valentis. The night they came for my father, she was the one who unlocked the gate." He felt the old rage simmering, but it was different now. Dull, like a scar being pressed rather than a fresh wound. "I didn't kill her," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I let her run. I wanted her to live with the knowledge of what she'd done. But I promised myself that I would never be that fool again. I would never let a name have power over me." Sofia reached out, her fingers gently covering his on the railing. "I am not Elena, Alessandro." He snapped his head toward her, his eyes dark. "I know you're not. That's what makes this worse. She betrayed me, so I knew how to hate her. You haven't done anything but tell the truth. And in my world, the truth is the most dangerous betrayal of all." The night deepened, and with it, the silence of the villa became heavy, expectant. Alessandro retreated to his study, but he couldn't focus on the tactical maps or the intelligence reports. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the Valenti strike he knew was coming. Around midnight, the power flickered and then died, plunging the villa into a terrifying absolute darkness. The backup generators should have kicked in instantly. They didn't. Alessandro was on his feet in a second, his Beretta drawn and leveled at the door. "Marco!" He shouted into his comms, but there was only static. The silence was back, but this time, it was the silence of the grave. He moved through the dark house with the grace of a predator, his night vision straining to catch any movement. He made his way toward Sofia's room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the door, his weapon raised, only to find the room empty. The French doors leading to the terrace were swinging open in the wind, the white curtains billowing like ghosts. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his chest. "Sofia," he called out, his voice cracking. He ran onto the terrace, his eyes scanning the gardens below. There, near the edge of the cliff where the bougainvillea grew thickest, he saw a flash of white. He moved toward it, his boots skidding on the stone, his mind screaming 1,000 different scenarios. He reached the edge of the garden and skidded to a halt. Sofia was standing there, silhouetted against the moonlit sea. But she wasn't alone. A man stood behind her, a knife pressed to the hollow of her throat. It was the messenger from the gate, his face twisted into a triumphant sneer. "You're getting slow, Moretti," the man taunted. "You were so busy watching the cameras that you forgot to watch the shadows." Alessandro didn't breathe. He kept his gun leveled at the man's forehead, his hand as steady as a rock despite the storm inside him. "Let her go," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "If you touch her, there isn't a hole in Italy deep enough to hide you." The man laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "My uncle doesn't want her dead, Alessandro. Not yet. He wants you to remember. He wants you to feel the weight of the silence again." He started to pull her back toward the cliff's edge, where a narrow path led down to the hidden coves below. Alessandro's finger tightened on the trigger. He had a clear shot, but the risk of hitting Sofia was too high. He felt the eyes of 15 years ago trying to reclaim him, trying to tell him to be the machine, to make the sacrifice for the sake of the empire. Then, Sofia did something he didn't expect. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She leaned her head back against her captor's shoulder and looked directly at Alessandro. In the moonlight, her eyes were like twin stars. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a catalyst. "Alessandro," she whispered. Just his name. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was a command. It was the sound of a woman who knew exactly who he was, even if he had forgotten. In that split second, the world seemed to slow down. Alessandro didn't think about the empire. He didn't think about the betrayal or the silence or the law of the underworld. He thought about the way her breath felt against his skin in the office. He thought about the warmth she had brought into his cold, dead house. The machine broke. The man took over. He lowered his aim just a fraction and fired. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him away from Sofia. She dived to the ground as the man stumbled back, losing his footing on the slick grass. With a cry of rage, he disappeared over the edge of the cliff, his body hitting the rocks far below with a sickening thud. Alessandro didn't even look over the edge. He was at Sofia's side in an instant, pulling her into his arms, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he gasped, his voice raw with a desperation he had never allowed himself to feel. She shook her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm fine. I'm fine, Alessandro." He pulled her tight against him, burying his face in her hair, the scent of jasmine and salt air filling his lungs. He was no longer the cold boss. He was a man who had almost lost the only thing that made him feel alive. But as he held her, he saw the flickering lights of boats approaching the cove below. The Valentis weren't done. They were just getting started. He looked at Sofia. His expression hardened into something far more dangerous than his previous silence. This was no longer just a war of shadows. This was a war for her. He stood up, pulling her with him, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "The silence is over, Sofia," he said, his voice echoing over the sound of the crashing waves. "Now they're going to hear me scream." He turned back toward the villa, where the backup lights were finally beginning to flicker to life. The first part of his life, the long, cold 15 years of isolation, was dead and buried. The second part was beginning, and it would be written in fire. He led her back toward the house, his grip on her hand unbreakable. Behind them, the sea continued to churn, a witness to the moment the coldest man in Naples finally broke his vow. Alessandro's world explodes as the Valenti family launches an all-out assault. To protect Sofia, he must become the monster he tried to bury. But will his newfound love be his greatest strength or his final undoing? Watch as the silence shatters completely in Part 2.